Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Claire Murphy and I'm a researcher here at ASPI Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement Program and co-author along with David Connery and Hayley Channer of A Web of Harms, Serious and Organised Crime and its Impact on Australian Interests. On behalf of ASPI, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Now, this special report aims to reinvigorate discussion amongst all Australians about the critical matter of serious and organised crime. This investigation led us to conduct over 55 interviews with different organisations in Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne, making this possibly one of the most diverse investigations that ASPI has ever undertaken. This indicates that serious and organised crime is an issue affecting a very broad range of national interests. So we need a similarly broad conversation between the community, business and the government to best address it. To discuss how to go about this, it's my pleasure to welcome Chris Dawson, CEO of the Australian Crime Commission. Under Chris's leadership, the Crime Commission has investigated this matter as discussed in their Organised Crime in Australia report released in May this year. Please make him welcome.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you, Peter and David and Hayley, for the opportunity to assist in the launch of this important paper, A Web of Harms, Serious and Organised Crime and its Impact on Australian Interests. So with the work that the Australian Crime Commission is doing, it's an interesting migration. I was talking to a Canadian colleague who's a fellow here at the moment, having a similar reminiscence of our time as police officers in quite remote, vast areas. I originally hail from Western Australia, and when you're trying to police 2.5 square million kilometres, you often had to work by yourself, and our Canadian colleague was having a similar sort of experience. And as we change and our environment changes, and particularly as crime, and we're going to focus on serious and organised crime, we have to be adaptable and understand how that can impact on you. And as I'm talking to you right now, you will maybe a victim of serious and organised crime. You may not think you are, but you could indeed be. Why don't we just have a quick look at a video, and it might give us some reminders about that.
Serious and organised crime is global and complex and costs Australia billions of dollars each year. But the true impact to individuals, families and communities is much greater. Each year, more than 1 million Australians are victims of identity crime. By stealing your identity, criminals can open bank accounts, obtain loans, passports, and other documents in your name. This causes financial and reputational damage, as well as emotional and psychological harm. Over 500,000 Australians are victims of card fraud each year. Through card skimming, organised criminals can create counterfeit cards, running up debts and causing long-term reputational damage and financial harm. Illicit drugs affect more than the users. Clandestine laboratories expose the community to volatile and explosive chemicals, putting them at risk of illness, injury or death. The impact of crystal methylamphetamine, or ICE, is straining emergency service personnel, medical practitioners, and the entire health system. Through fraudulent investment or superannuation schemes, even the most financially aware individual can become a victim. The financial loss impacts individuals and families and results in more people relying on Australia's social security system. In 2013, an estimated 5 million Australians were victims of cybercrime. Downloading infected files or malware can corrupt or steal your information. Its sophistication means it often avoids antivirus software. Organised crime groups use money laundering to legitimise or hide proceeds of crime. Money laundering is transnational and complex, using a range of methods from foreign currency exchange trading to virtual currencies and high-value commodities such as real estate. The Australian Crime Commission has seen direct links between money laundering and other serious crime types, such as large illicit drug importations and terrorism financing. Law enforcement, the government and industry are responding to these threats. The Organised Crime in Australia 2015 report provides a picture of the organised crime landscape to better inform responses and prevent future harm. By being aware of the threats, you can protect yourself. For more information, go to www.crimecommission.gov.au.
So just as an example, you could be sitting here and having your bank account skimmed. Let's hope it's not. The banking sector in Australia, in fact, have been quite resilient and are continuing to do a lot of work with law enforcement in ensuring that your assets are as safe as we possibly can get. But I don't want to reminisce too much, but in the 1980s, when I was working in the fraud squad, I would literally have to hire a truck to seize exhibits, because they were all paper-based ledger accounts, and we were dealing with cheques and hard copy ledgers. When modern investigators are now looking at fraud, they're looking at online, digital accounts. Even when law enforcement are looking at burglaries or criminal damage, the equivalent of that in the digital space is online hacking or denial of service attacks. Similarly so with sex offending. Rather than looking for that devious person who was doing the contact offending, and regrettably that still occurs, there's now the capacity digitally for pedophiles in other continents to hack into a home and virtually view a young child undressing in their room if there's a computer in there, because they can remotely hack in there. The child pornography websites can be done through darknets and exchanges, and law enforcement are continually having to try and interdict those sorts of matters. With money laundering, and the video touched on some of that, but it's not just as simple as what we might call structuring, where some entities in the criminal world are skimming lots of money through trade-based economies or virtual economies and currencies such as Bitcoin and others, but they're putting things just under the 10,000 threshold to avoid some of the reporting, and there's about 4 other ways at least that they can money launder. Theft is no longer something physical exclusively. Your identity can be stolen. There can be website phishing. Music, software piracy is something which is now a digital theft, and indeed stalking, as opposed to someone physically stalking behind them. The harm that can be done both to individuals and reputations can be done in the virtual sense. So whether it's a knock-on effect of cybercrime, or indeed whether it is the physical harm that gets attached to families and communities, such as what we highlighted in the video there with crystal methylamphetamine, what the Australian Crime Commission consider to be the illicit drug of highest harm because of the attached violence often that's associated with that, and the profit that organised crime are getting out of the prices that Australians pay, which in the scheme of things is about $650 a gram, whereas in China it's about $100 a gram. So you're seeing massive increases in criminal profits coming out of that. You may have seen the cardboard cutouts as you came in, highlighting some of the statistics that are impacting on the issue of cybercrime. Our estimation is that in a 12-month period, 5 million Australians are victims of cybercrime, quite a high percentage. In terms of the labs that are mainly producing amphetamine-type substances, of the clandestine laboratories found in Australia in the last reporting year, 68% were in residential homes. So it's not just the production of those drugs themselves, but the toxins that get left behind there, and often there are children living in those homes where you might have drug-addicted parents that are either subsistence or addict-type producers, or indeed you have about 10% of the 700-odd labs that were found and discovered by police around the country. We estimate about 10% are industrial style labs. But the diversification of that market is a very important trend for both our intelligence and our law enforcement bodies to keep track of. I recall a conversation I had with the Drug Enforcement Administration about 15 years ago when Australian law enforcement and intelligence are still concentrating very heavily on a whole lot of different criminal syndicates, but one of the most virulent are the outlaw motorcycle groups. They comprise of about 7,500 people, either patched members or associates, and they are probably the most visible that the public see as the most serious of criminals. They are not the only ones, but they are certainly very visible. My conversation 15 years ago with the DEA, and I asked the question, how are you going with the outlaw motorcycle groups here, the Hells Angels, Banditos, etc., with the drug issue? And their response to me was quite surprising at the time. Said, oh no, they've been knocked out of that. The market's forces have shifted. Now the Mexicans have taken over because they had industrialised the processing, they had chemists instead of part-time cooks, they had flooded the market with a cheaper product, and so the bikies had moved on to what they call the skin trade in terms of pornography, prostitution, extortion, and those sorts of matters. So the markets do shift, and if communities and the intelligence and law enforcement community don't adapt and get in front of some of those market forces, then we're simply in that reactive mode. So look, there'll be a never-ending list of organised crime. The paper that is being launched tonight does journey us through some of these environmental changes that are occurring. Certainly in the Crime Commission's assessment, which we do on a biannual basis with an unclassified report, our most recent report characterises 3 areas that organised crime have trended. And those trends are the ability to conceal criminal activities by integrating into legitimate markets. So no longer just known as, a bit like the cartoon characters of the Beagle Boys, they can present themselves as very legitimate entities, and indeed they mix up their business. So it's quite much more difficult, and the level of sophistication is such that it's not quite as easy to delineate whether in fact they are criminal entities or legitimate entities. The second trend that we've reported on is the ability to exploit new technologies in online environments. An example of such, which the Crime Commission worked with federal and state police recently, involved a international-based, with terrorist links, card skimming entity who were able to use point-of-sale handsets, Bluetooth technology, and able to simply do that at food outlets and get in the order of $7 million a day by sitting several hundred metres away and being able to actually get people's PIN numbers when they'd been swiped through the various FPOS machines. That sort of level of sophistication, which required some quite high-end design, but able then to internationally use those cards in a coordinated way, are examples of sophistication that law enforcement didn't have to contend with 10 years ago. And then, as I've just touched on, the other trend is the truly globalised nature of criminal operations. The domestic focus is necessary, but in the Crime Commission's estimation, 70% of Australia's most serious criminal syndicates have a footprint internationally. They will either have direct connections or they will place people offshore. And so we can no longer just look to harden our own borders. And so we are working very closely with our partner agencies in an international context as well. The threat of cybercrime, which we opened up on, and its deep penetration into the internet does impact on your life and my life every day. Whether it's downloading infected files, the malware that we've got to try and prevent occurring, it continues to adapt and evolve, and the rapidity of that change is a matter that's a very, very big challenge for us all. The exploitation of the internet and technologies to target the community through these online type scams are impacting on the community increasingly every day. As an example, a recent hacker broke into an online travel agent provider systems, stole the personal details of about 770,000 customers. That's just one example, and just a recent one. So what used to take a long period of planning to undertake a crime and then to execute that crime can now occur in a nanosecond, from what used to be, in some cases, months and months of planning. We know that the million-odd Australians who became victims of identity crime in the last year by theft of their identity. And in fact, it happened recently to me. In terms of cards being stolen and things like that, you've got to be very agile, very quick to make sure that your assets aren't further harmed and stolen. Over 500,000 Australians are victims of card fraud each year through things such as skimming. The issue of illicit drugs, and look, it's not a really good news story I'm telling you tonight, but the blunt reality of it is that we've got an ever-increasing tide, and that's why it's important that through papers such as this special report, we can get a better understanding and we can put in place the sorts of responses and effort to better understand and better interdict. The matter of, and everyone in this room probably has a superannuation account, but how often do you check it? Do you check it online regularly, or do you just wait for that quarterly sort of report that comes out? And that's probably the case. Our estimation is that in the coming years there'll be up to $6 trillion sitting in those superannuation accounts. That is a tremendous target for organised crime. And so we're working with that sector and with our partner agencies to ensure that we put as much protection, but part of that is about actually understanding the way you can protect your assets and also enabling law enforcement to respond to that. And one such example is the ACORN system in which people can report. If I reflect back again, as I at times do, and I have already today, to fronting up at a counter as a young constable, I wasn't armed with the capacity to receive such a report. I had no training, I didn't quite understand that, in fact it was still evolving. And we have to make sure that as we all use it in our everyday part of lives, that we've got the people and the design and the planning to be able to assist the community in the responses to what are quite complex and costly matters that we're all facing. As I mentioned in one of those trends, the loss of legitimate business and taxation revenue has a major impact on our society and indeed our economy. And to manage those social harms and the impact it does have, organised crime, of course, are in there for greed and they're in there for profit, and they'll have many opportunities, and they can and do that. So as outlined through this ASPI report, they are a threat also beyond the criminal sector into our national security. They undermine our economy, they infringe our border integrity and our sovereignty, and damage our prosperity. And this goes to the crux of this web of harms. The damage caused by serious and organised crime is real and present. I haven't given you much good news, but there is some good news. The partners in criminal intelligence, law enforcement and national security, I strongly believe, are in a much better position than we have been in previous years. There is increasing collaboration and cooperation. There's very important work underway in integration of our systems, in the capacity to analyse large pieces of data, and I've personally seen the collaboration between heads of agencies better than I've ever seen before. And that is not then exclusive just to the government agencies and the police agencies. That's also extending to the private and the community sector. And those relationships with, e.g. the big four banks and other such business leaders, again, not just conversations and in a matter of crisis, but relationships that we can assist and work along and with each other. So the National Organised Crime Response Plan of 2015 to 18 aims to enhance these strategies and put quite comprehensive response plans to the existing strategies, and ways in which that can be supplemented by the work that government's doing at a policy level with, for instance, matters such as cybercrime. And that's critically important. Matters such as the National Identity Security Strategy in order to harden our environment against organised crime. As a result of recent investigations, and we touched on in the video about money laundering, the Crime Commission, working with our partners, have been able to interdict some of the most serious global money launderers that we've identified to date. That's with our international colleagues. We have a estimation that in excess of 100, what we would call, are super facilitators. These are people that move hundreds of millions of dollars every day. And it's a matter whether they do it through a system known as Hawala, whether they do it through offsetting, through different false bank accounts, or through virtual currencies. There are hundreds of millions of dollars being moved globally. And so when an organised criminal can't dispose of their assets here, they'll do it internationally, and they can do it very quickly. So the task force, Aligo, that is one of those task forces. AFP are leading another one called Zanella. They are very important task forces that not only help us better understand, but we are actually getting very good results in terms of that. The work further with our respective partners in terms of matters such as ransomware, where both public and private entities are being held to ransom, or their hardware is getting locked up or wiped off. We've been able to identify some very serious players in international spaces, and our partner agencies are working very closely with us. So engagement with the public is quite critical to the success in combating organised crime. By being aware of these threats, you can also better protect yourselves. So I do commend the special report, A Web of Harms, to you, and thank ASPI and David and others for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now I'd like to introduce lead author and senior analyst in ASPI's Strategic Law Enforcement Program, David Connery, to go into further detail about the harms outlined in this report. Please make him welcome.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Chris. Really appreciated you taking the time tonight to come here, but also too for the support you give ASPI and the encouragement you give us to go into some pretty sensitive but also pretty complex areas, and we do appreciate that, and for all your team, thank you. Can also thank all of you for coming tonight. Your presence here demonstrates that there is a real interest in the broader dimensions of national security within Australia, and I thank you very much for coming along. Also too for the many friends I see in the audience and people who've graciously given their time a number of times for us to talk to them about some of these very perplexing issues. Web of Harms came about because we wanted to add to the efforts that other people were making to explain organised crime to the Australian public. You'll notice in the report, and I've got hammered by the editors to cut down from the 110 or so references we actually had. We tried to draw very heavily upon the excellent research that's already out there, research and being done by the Crime Commission, by the Australian Institute of Criminology, and by a couple of friends who are sitting around in the audience as well. There is a lot out there. We thought there was great value in bringing it together in different format, in a different way to present it to the public. We particularly wanted to take a different track than what others had taken, and we wanted to take a more qualitative approach to explaining to people how how organised crime harms their everyday life, harms their business, but also then harms our national security. So that's why we take you through what it does to individuals, all the way through to what Australians do when they travel overseas, and how that contributes to harms in places where we're actually giving aid and the like. We've drawn some tough conclusions. We want to talk about changing people's behaviour, because we believe unless the Australian public changes their attitude to the illicit economy, then organised crime will continue to have a market and a foothold. But of course, we also recommend it's not just about the active participation of Australians in these markets. We also know, and Chris has brought up through particularly through the cyber domain, where people will unwittingly become and very unwittingly become victims of serious and organised crime. We have also tried to pose a number of questions at the end that we think both the community, the business sector, and indeed government need to think about. We hope those questions will continue to spark a debate, and from those questions we've drawn part of our research agenda, which I'll touch on later. The Web of Harms project, though, has been more than just this one paper. We recognise that our papers do reach a fairly limited audience, so we've tried through this project to hit a number of major Australian newspapers and their international media portals in order to get this message across. So we've got ourselves into places like the Herald Sun, Canberra Times, the Australian, and the like, to try to get the message out there and get it out beyond the normal community that would come to a place like this. Because we think the media and getting it out into Australians' everyday lives is a way to get this message across. We also hope that they'll not only take precautions as a result of that, but also too, they'll be more willing to support agencies when agencies need maybe additional powers, additional resources, and that vital resource information as they go about their jobs. So before we close and invite questions, I'd really like to thank the supporters of ASPI who are helping in our strategic policing and law enforcement program, especially the Crime Commission, the Australian Federal Police, and it's great to see some of our friends from AFP here tonight as well, and also OmniExec, who've been supporting us for the last couple of years. Their support across all three has been really critical in helping our small team understand the nature of the criminal threats to Australia, understand how law enforcement contributes to our international objectives, and also too to understand the future of this area, which has been our three research themes. The time that people from these agencies spend with us, the trust they give us, is critical to our job. We really thank them for it. Of course, I'd also like to thank my ASPI friends who helped bring this paper together, Claire and Hayley in particular for their efforts, but also to Janice, who's our publications manager, to also thank Karen for bringing this together tonight, to thank our media team of Luke and Fleur, and also just our colleagues, particularly those we've been able to bounce some of these tough ideas off. In addition to those, I'd like to thank the couple of reviewers who really helped make this paper a much stronger paper, and I do thank them for their support in getting this through. So when we look to the future of where the strategic policing and law enforcement program might go, we've got some key priorities. Great thing here now at ASPI is that we're now building a much broader team of people who are working in national security issues. We've got our very well-established cyber policy team. We have our growing border security team, as well as a brand new program that's looking at counter-terrorism. That's great for us. That allows us in strategic policing to focus a little bit more on a couple of issues, but it also means that ASPI can now pair and partner across broader ranges of topics, and that's really exciting. The things I'm hoping we'll do in the future, really looking forward to making some positive contributions to the AFP's Future Directions project. I think this is a great initiative. It's quite exciting. My interactions with Commissioner so far have really made me quite confident that AFP really wants to think about their future, so we're hoping to make some positive contributions there. We're hoping too to expand our remit into the financial crime area. We think that financial crime is going to be one of the key issues, if not already, it certainly will be into the future, and we're looking to expand there. Also too, a personal interest of mine is to look at information sharing between the community, business and law enforcement agencies. This is a gap that's been noted in the Organised Crime Response Plan. I've been fortunate enough to get a fellowship from the Winston Churchill Trust to go and look at this, and I'm really looking forward to looking at what people are doing in the global setting to see what we can bring back here to Australia. So, just on behalf of Claire and Hayley, can I thank you all very much for coming along, for sharing with us what we think is an important topic, and also for showing that people, regardless of where they live, they really must be concerned about how organised crime is going to affect not just their security, but also their daily lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'll now open the floor to questions for our panel. I'd be grateful if you could kindly introduce yourself if you'd be happy to, and please keep your questions brief. I might get the ball rolling, actually. David, the report states that the internet is increasing the speed, the reach and the depth of the way that organised crime occurs. I was wondering if you might discuss in what ways the cyber domain is increasing the risk of organised crime to a greater amount of Australians.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Look, I think Chris hit on a number of the key statistics really easily, but we've tried to make the point in different places. It used to be in the past that you had to go to a dodgy place in Sydney, you had to go to the Cross, you had to go to the Valley in Brisbane before you met someone who is really dealing in organised crime. That's just not the case now. That the internet is enabling people to come into your home and to affect your life. And guaranteed, well, maybe not guaranteed, but probably greater probability they're going to be involved in an organised criminal activity. That means that we've got to really start thinking and really start communicating to people the need for them to take precautions, for them to understand the risks. And I point to work that we've cited that Toby Feakin and his friend Callum have done to try to explain these issues and bring it more to into public attention.
Excellent. Chris, I might turn to you, and I'd be interested in how you might think we might be able to get the community to care more about organised crime, particularly ways in which they might change their behaviour that currently funds or enables organised criminals.
I think when people are personally affected, that's probably the best education. I'll use 2 examples from last weekend. My son was selling a four-wheel drive in response to his online ad. The first response he got within minutes was, I work offshore, I can't come back to Australia yet, but I've got a mate who's coming in and he'll come and pick up the car. Can you forward me your details, da-da-da-da-da. He was, astute enough to say, go try somewhere else because I'm not going to give you my account details. A colleague was also selling a car the same weekend. He got the exact same email. Now, this is a level of sophistication which the public won't necessarily know, but there are 2 personal instances I saw just last weekend, one involving a member of my family. Now, they may have come from West Africa. Nigeria is well known for that sort of stuff, but hey, they're not the only ones there. It could be Lithuania, it could be Australia, it could be anywhere. And this is one of the points about the sophistication and the use of the digital economy, is that criminals can pervade anywhere now globally, and it's a very effective way of doing business. So I think the response is to get a much broader education, but also give the tools to not just the education of the community, but to industry and to law enforcement and security, that we can actually combat that.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant given the increasing ways in which we use the internet to do some of our day-to-day activities that we might have done in person or otherwise previously. David, information sharing between business and government has been cited as a key strategy for countering organised crime. How do you think we could improve on our current efforts?
This is, I suppose, the $64,000 question that I'm going to investigate as part of the fellowship. But we're already seeing, I think, an important shift within the law enforcement community to working out how they can engage business better. And I know the crime commissions have made some changes to the legislation to allow them to share more broadly. And we've also seen a number of online portals coming through. To me, some of the areas that I'm really keen on looking at is where not-for-profits have been set up in order to facilitate trusted information sharing between law enforcement and community sector. I've seen a few of these in America, just read about them so far, so looking forward to visiting those. The other interesting thing is going to be to help business understand more that they're often getting hit by organised crime and not just non-compliance. We spoke to a number of different business organisations, and look, after you work on a bit and develop a bit of trust, a bit of rapport, they will start talking to you about the criminal threat. But for many of them, they saw the individual acts, but not necessarily the organisation behind it. They may not necessarily be inclined to report it as such. They're probably more there unless they think they can get something done about it. But those bits of information, I think, are going to be critical for law enforcement to understanding just the size of the challenge and the way that it's operating.
Yeah, certainly from our investigations, we saw a lot of overlap between what would some see as organised crime and what others might see as non-compliance, which I think is another reason to get more conversations going about this topic. I'd love to hog the discussion, but I should probably open up to our guests. So does anyone have any questions for our panel at this stage? Gentleman up the front.
Thank you. Clinton Firth, I'm the General Manager for Cyber Security in CSC, Australia, New Zealand. So the question I've got is that internationally we're seeing a lot more of a acknowledgement that there's a widening gap between offence, and the defenders are sort of going backwards almost, even from an industry perspective. Besides information sharing, what are some other strategies that you think, Chris, that we could sort of employ and how we can get better at this? Any ideas?
I think that's what the current white paper that the government are considering in front of them is such an important from a policy perspective. But I think it's actually, like most crime types, it's actually making that broader awareness so that both industry and individuals actually understand that this impacts on them or their business or their brand, and they will then have not just a head knowledge, but they'll be able to actually put things into play so that educating their workers, making sure that their systems are being patched regularly and all those sorts of things that technologically can be done. But I think this is also about attitude and behaviour, so that people, like David touched on and the paper does, you can go to any city in the world and go to a certain part of the city at 2, 3, 4 a.m. and you're going to run into trouble. Every city has them, any major one. But in the digital space, you don't quite have your sensory perceptions up as high. So I think it's a broader educational space from both industry and the individual to actually get that sensory perception up. You understand what you're getting confronted with.
Yes, just up the left-hand side.
Hi, this is Xun Chao Zhang from Australian Institute of International Affairs. My question is about, can you talk about some mechanism in which Australia work with other states in the region to stop the trafficking of illicit drugs, particularly methamphetamine?
I'm going to hand over that to you because I know you. But I think some of the really good things I've been seeing has been in the law enforcement cooperation space and particularly in the capacity development space. So if I could highlight that, people are often thinking that things that we're doing overseas are all about really charity and aid. Where we're seeing Australian police now go offshore, they're training other police so they can be far more effective and allow us to cooperate with them so we can exchange information, exchange briefs of evidence and hopefully get convictions either in our country or theirs. So I've been really interested in watching what what the AFP is doing in Indonesia in particular. We're also hoping we'll have a paper coming out soon which is looking at strategic criminal intelligence offshore and what we can do to better enhance our system for both collecting and disseminating strategic criminal intelligence. So I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that paper.
Thanks. I mean, it's probably the most dominant issue in terms of the illegal importation across our borders. As I mentioned earlier on, 70% of our most serious criminal entities are international or have international footprint there. So our relationship with both the border force, customs, industry, the postal systems, etc. Because when you're trying to get an assessment of how it's coming across our border, whether it be through sea cargo, postal or whatever, better to try and interdict it in some of those originating areas and also work with those countries and help them harden up their own internal mechanisms such as precursors, particularly for the synthetic drugs, so that they're able to better interrupt at those supply chains. Australia's not unique in being both a domestic producer but also a victim of overseas importations, as indeed the other countries are. So the UNODC estimates about 49 countries are embarkation points for illicit drugs into Australia. So it's a big area, but certainly there are a couple of prominent areas through Africa, Central Americas, Iran and China that are worthy of probably higher concentration.
Gentleman at the front.
Bob Lowry, my interest is Indonesia, but my question is not related to that. I haven't read the report, so I obviously don't know the content of it. But one of the big issues that's not under discussion at the moment in a public sense, but it has been historically, is the question of criminalisation of drug taking. Have you looked at this issue as part of the strategy for overcoming the problem, in other words, decriminalising it, or is this something that's beyond your remit?
Look, obviously, Bob, not an expert in drug policy, but we raised the question in this, and we think this is something that the Australian people need to think seriously about. Do we have our drug policy settings right? When you go through another great piece of work that Chris's people do in the illicit drug data report, you see overwhelmingly seizures are about marijuana, and you've got to ask yourself, is that the best use of the limited resource that we have? Now, haven't been able to find out good straight answers about whether marijuana is more harmful to people than alcohol or not, and I'm still looking for it, for example. But I think it's a question we've got to ask ourselves and just make sure that it is about evidence, it is about harm, rather than about social mores that may have been prevalent for a little while ago, but are no longer held by the majority of the community.
Lady in the middle.
Liz Bolton from ANU, also with the Australian Army. I was just wondering if they've had much thought about the sort of the strategic drivers or the social drivers that are influencing this. For example, is it related to unemployment levels? And even when you compare with terrorism, that sometimes it's an attractive workplace for people to go into because there's no other option, but it creates there's a lot of issues about identity and belonging and stuff that are attracting people to this sort of type of work. So I was just wondering if you're looking at the long-term systemic influences.
It's a really interesting question, both from a serious and organised crime space, but also from a national security space. If I start on the former, the emergence of bikies post-Second World War is quite a well-known journey. There's been quite a lot of literature reviews and studies about that, where demobbed military officers had then formed a fraternity. But it's very interesting if you look at the most recent evolutionary approach of outlaw motorcycle gangs. When I started nearly 40 years ago in policing, there was a very staunch brotherhood, often a white supremacist approach to it. They went through a nomination, probationary, quite a rite of passage, often a very distasteful one and a very violent one in which you had to prove yourself. That would take quite a number of years before you were accepted. Once you're accepted, you're locked into it. Now there's an approach. I'll name the Rebels Outlaw Motorcycle Group as one such example, which I call it as a franchising model, where they don't go through all that rite of passage. They simply put them on tick to go out and start doing serious drug dealing straight away, and they get patched up straight away. So what comes with that is this capacity to be very overt in a threatening way because they hunt in packs, they're very violent, but there's quite a different journey by which this migration has occurred. In the national security sector, the pathway and radicalisation, there's a lot of studies being done at the moment. We're one of those agencies that are assisting in the national security space with other partners that are more heavily in that space as well. Certainly there has been a lot of work, and that's continuing, in how long is the radicalisation pathway. Now you're seeing younger people through social media being subject of radicalisation in a much faster, agile way than you had traditionally seen, where people had taken a longer step and a longer journey to reach a point of radicalisation.
Now, Russell Smith from the Australian Institute of Criminology has done some interesting work and looking at the life stories of criminals and their pathways and journeys from people who are maybe minor offenders through to people who are far more serious. And it's a really good read and a nice easy one as well, but it might help you piece together the many different ways people will move from a legitimate life style into a criminal one.
Yes, gentleman, back.
Michael Keating, Editor-in-Chief of Inside Canberra from the Federal Press Gallery in Parliament House. In regard to digital fraud, you say a lot of the offenders are offshore and perhaps from countries that are unstable, West African nations that may not have strong democratic principles such as ours, so we may have difficulty accessing them and then prosecuting them. I was wondering, what is the success rate in getting to those offenders and then returning the proceeds of crime that have been stolen if the majority of them are offshore?
There have been some successful operations. I recall one from my former agency, the Western Australian Police, who worked very closely with ASPI and also with the Nigerian police, were able to prosecute several offenders who had in fact stolen the digital title deeds and in fact had forced the sale of a property without the owners knowing. They were successfully arrested and prosecuted in Nigeria. So there are, in some of those countries that do struggle with some of that stability that you touched on, some good efforts being made. But that's, I think, also lends to David's earlier comment about how Australian authorities can support and assist some of our international colleagues who perhaps haven't had the training, skill or technology to assist them in that. So that's why that international cooperation is quite good. As to the recovery of assets, that's a more challenging one. I'll leave to my Attorney General colleagues that are in the room.
Yeah, there's a case just recently where these Australian authorities were giving training to a country who returned the favour by quickly turning around and taking an Australian brief of evidence, prosecuting people and recovering the money internally. The money stayed there, as I understand it, but it was a really quick turnaround. But it was simply that these people didn't have the skills to actually do something that was quite so complex as this kind of crime. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Peter Jennings from ASPI. Chris, this is probably one for you, but David, welcome your thoughts as well. In the press, there's a sort of an often made connection between terrorism and organised crime. Organised crime as a sort of a method of raising funds for terrorist organisation. In practice, Chris, do you actually see that? I mean, is that something that's borne out by your understanding of the issue? And if so, does it have any a sort of ripple effects back into Australia, particularly? Do you see any evidence of that as well?
We've definitely identified connections between facilitators of money being moved and terrorism, direct connection. More importantly is understanding that those international facilitators that I spoke of earlier in my address will work for anyone. They're poly-market users. They will have a commodity and they're quite prepared to trade with anyone because they'll get anywhere between 3%, 4%, 5%, depending on how quickly someone wants to move $1 million. They can quickly make $50,000 if they move it within 24 hours. So they will work with terrorist organisations and they'll also work with serious and organised crime, but they are a very important node and facilitator who may well have direct, and do have, in some cases, we've identified direct connection with prescribed terrorist entities. And then you've got to also understand that the people that are moving the money, some may be sympathisers and want money to head that way, others may simply just want to launder their profits. But you'll have these very key facilitators that will have that interplay between the two.
And the international groups, there's a number that are well known and that either use use organised crime to fund their terrorist activities, but then get a bit of a taste for it and decide they're going to stay in that game, and that makes it particularly challenging for us. I think one of the things on the money laundering side that's interesting is that when we were first talking about this, that I can recall, maybe 15 years ago, people were looking for large amounts of money moving through to be laundered. Not the case now. It seems like we've got to be looking for smaller and smaller amounts because in order to facilitate the travel foreign terrorist fighters, you're only looking at a few $1,000s type thing, but that's still the kind of money that's being moved through in that counter-terrorism financing area.
Another thing, one I think it's pretty clear IS is making significant money out of is trade in antiquities, but that strikes me as a curious thing because it's a very defined market. But I'm just wondering again from your perspective, have you seen any connections that sort of brings that back into Australia here, or are you aware of international measures which might be attempting to control that market more effectively to prevent these things being sold?
I haven't seen any from the Australian perspective in terms of antiquities, but I'm aware of our international law enforcement colleagues, particularly FBI and some of the British forces are quite heavily involved in that particular type of crime, but not from an Australian perspective. But going back to the earlier question, it's not an unknown phenomenon. In fact, you can go back to the troubles in Ireland. IRA were very heavy into facilitating a lot of their fundraising through crime, as indeed the Al-Qaeda Spanish bombing of the trains there, financed through serious organised crime activities.
I thought you were going to go back to the British East India Company.
Just on that note, the relationship between organised crime and terrorism, we've seen increased law enforcement efforts looking at terrorism over the past 12 to 18 months. Do you think this potentially makes it a good time to be an organised criminal?
No. Do you want me to expand on that? Look, as much as it's very sobering to note that with the rapid technological change and the challenge that we're all facing, it's also providing wonderful opportunities for national security, intelligence, law enforcement to make very successful inroads. Those very same sophisticated tools that are being used by serious criminals are in fact being very well used by national security, law enforcement as well. So, you know, there are some very big wins happening. We just can't always proclaim them because you don't always want to just declare your capability. Simple as that.
Yes, Zeph.
Jason Brown from Talus, or any other organisation you care to name. The interesting part is the nexus to private enterprise, and I'm interested in any comments on the increasing focus of criminal and other related groups focusing on CEOs, company secretaries, senior legal people involved in contracting, etc., as a global issue, both for identity theft at one end to simulate the CEO to have access to a range of things, or to specifically target them for general funds raising.
Dr. Bergen.
What do you want to tell us about that one, Jason?
Oh, sorry.
Well, I was wondering to know if you'd done any work in that space.
No, personally no, but I've heard anecdotally in newspaper reports of that kind of targeting of those very senior individuals, and you hear stories of someone who's able to impersonate a CEO to sign a contract and have that money transferred to someone, but we haven't done any research on it.
No.
Yeah, I've got to say.
I did have a fellow who posed as a barrister once. He successfully defended a few people. Didn't have a law degree.
No, I'll be blunt and say we just
Yeah.
with someone imitating senior officials globally in Talus as part of a social engineering attack on the company.
Yeah.
We were able to identify them, but it's really interesting if without the capabilities, a company would not be able to do that. So it's a really interesting, newish trend.
And I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question for Chris. Mark, you identified three trends, the difficulty in legitimate versus illegitimate, and that's the question. Are you seeing any difficulties with sort of faith-based giving and even Islamic financing?
Look, there's a lot of work internationally in terms of some of the charities that have been established over the years. I think it's a case of law enforcement and security having to be very vigilant about that, because whether it is through the financing of some criminal entity or serious and organised crime, they'll use any mode. So look, there are some regulatory processes in place for some of those particular matters, but it's not exclusive to faith-based type charities. I mean, they will use any means they can. I think some of those charities legitimately are cherry ripe for criticism because of their faith, as opposed to simply being evidence that in fact that is being used. But I'm not trying to sit on the fence there. I think you've got to, and the authorities are, of course, paying a high amount of vigilance to a whole lot of money movements, whether they be faith-based or whether they be any other sector.